HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents The Five, the untold lives of the women killed by Jack the Ripper, by Hallie Rubenhold, read by Louise Brealey.
I write for those women who do not speak, for those who do not have a voice because they were so terrified, because we are taught to respect fear more than ourselves. We've been taught that silence would save us, but it won't. Audre Lorde. Introduction. A Tale of Two Cities. There are two versions of the events of 1887. One is very well known, the other is not. The first version is the one printed in most history books. It is the one that those who lived through the age wished to recall, the version they recounted to their grandchildren with a wistful smile. It is the story of Queen Victoria and a summer of celebrations for her Golden Jubilee. She had been no more than a teenage girl when the nation's weighty crown had been placed upon her head. A half-century later, she had become the embodiment of empire, and a suitably grand series of events had been planned to commemorate this. On the 20th of June, the precise day she had first mounted the throne, the royal heads of Europe, Indian princes, dignitaries and representatives from all corners of the empire, even the Hawaiian queen, Liliuokalani, converged upon London. West End shopkeepers adorned their windows in red, white and blue. Royal standards and Union Jacks, festoons of flowers and coloured garlands could be seen hanging from every sombre stony edifice. At night, the embassies and clubs, hotels and institutions throughout St James's and Piccadilly threw the switches on the electric lights and turned on the gas jets illuminating the giant crowns and the letters V and R affixed to their buildings. Her Majesty's loyal subjects came to the centre of town from the suburbs and tenements. They punched their rail tickets from Kent and Surrey and pushed their way into the crowded streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of a royal coach or a princess in diamonds. They placed candles in the windows of their homes when the long summer twilight faded away and toasted their monarch's health with beer and champagne and claret. There was a service of Thanksgiving at Westminster Abbey, a state banquet, a military review at Windsor, and even a children's fete in Hyde Park for 2,500 boys and girls who were entertained by 20 Punch and Judy puppets, 8 marionette theatres, 86 peep shows, 9 troupes of performing dogs, monkeys and ponies, as well as bands, toys and gas-inflated balloons, before being treated to a lunch of lemonade, cake, meat pies, buns and oranges. Throughout the summer, there were Jubilee commemorative concerts, lectures, performances, regattas, picnics, dinners, and even a yacht race. As the Jubilee corresponded with the traditional London season, there were also garden parties and balls. Ladies dressed themselves in the summer's fashion, lace-trimmed bustled gowns in black and white silk and hues of apricot yellow, heliotrope, and gobelin bleu. A magnificent ball was held at the Guildhall, where the Prince and Princess of Wales entertained their visiting regal relations, as well as the Prince of Persia, the papal envoy, the Prince of Siam, and the Maharaja Holkar of Indore. All of high society danced beneath the banners and cascading arrangements of perfumed flowers. Tiaras and tie pins sparkled in the mirrors. Young debutantes were introduced to suitable sons. The whirl of Victorian life spun round and round to the dreamy melody of a sweeping waltz. Then there is the other version. This is the tale of 1887 which most choose to forget. To this day, only a scant number of history books recount it. Surprisingly few people even know that it occurred. Yet in that year, this story filled more column inches than the descriptions of royal parades, banquets and fetes put together. That Jubilee summer had been an exceptionally warm and rainless one. The clear blue skies that presided over the season's carefree picnics and alfresco parties had shrivelled the fruit harvest and dried out the fields. Water shortages and an absence of seasonal agricultural labouring jobs only served to exacerbate an already growing employment crisis. While the wealthy enjoyed the fine weather from beneath their parasols and from under the trees of their suburban villas, the homeless and poor made use of it by creating an open-air encampment in Trafalgar Square. Many had come into the centre of town looking for work at Covent Garden Market, where Londoners bought their produce, but a drought meant fewer boxes of plums and pears to lift and haul. With no money for lodgings, they slept rough in the nearby square, where they were joined by an increasing population of unemployed and homeless workers who would rather turn to the street than face the deplorable and demeaning conditions in the workhouse. Much to the horror of observers, these campers could be seen making their morning ablutions and scrubbing their vermin-infested clothing in the fountains directly beneath the nose of Lord Nelson, who peered down from high atop his column. When the autumn began to move in, so too did the Socialists, the Salvation Army, and various charitable organisations, handing out Bibles, admission tickets to lodging houses, coffee, tea, bread, and soup. Tarpaulins were raised in makeshift bivouacs. Impassioned daily speeches were made between the paws of the giant bronze lions. The excitement, sense of community and free refreshments swelled the number of outcast Londoners, which brought the police, which in turn brought the journalists, who roamed among the square's bedraggled population collecting the names and stories of these otherwise anonymous squatters. Mr. Asheville called himself a painter and glazier by trade. He had been out of work for 12 months, 33 nights of which had been spent sleeping on the embankment, until the weather grew too cold, and he moved to Trafalgar Square in the hope it might prove a bit warmer. Dejected and visibly worn by his experience, he attempted to remain positive about his prospects of one day finding employment. A soldier's widow circled Trafalgar Square selling matches to support her young son, but she hadn't always lived like this. After failing to pay the final instalment on her hire purchase sewing machine, she had lost her livelihood and then the single room she had called home. As she knew that going into the workhouse would mean that her child would be separated from her, roughing it in the square each night with him curled up under her shawl seemed a better option. An elderly couple who had never before faced adversity found themselves sleeping together on one of the square's stone benches. The husband of the pair had been employed as a musical director at a theatre, but suffered an accident that rendered him unfit to work. With no savings, they soon fell behind on their rent and eventually were forced to make their bed under the stars. The thought of throwing themselves upon the mercy of their local workhouse was too shameful and frightening even to consider. Hundreds came to Trafalgar Square to lay their heads against the paving stones, each with a similar tale to tell. It did not take long for political agitators to recognise that this congregation of the downtrodden was a ready-made army of the angry with nothing to lose. Londoners had long realised that Trafalgar Square sat on an axis between the east and west of the city, the dividing line between rich and poor, an artificial boundary which, like the invisible restraints that kept the disenfranchised voiceless, could be easily breached. In 1887, the possibility of social revolution felt terrifyingly near for some, and yet not close enough for others. At Trafalgar Square, the daily speeches given by socialists and reformers such as William Morris, Annie Besant, Eleanor Marx and George Bernard Shaw led to mobilisation as chanting, banner-waving processions of thousands spilled onto the streets and inevitably into violence. The Metropolitan Police and the Magistrates' Court at Bow Street worked overtime in an attempt to contain the protesters and clear the square of those they considered to be indigents and rabble-rousers. But, like the irrepressible tide, no sooner were they pushed out than they returned once more. The fatal error came when, on the 8th of November, Sir Charles Warren, the Commissioner of Police, banned all meetings in Trafalgar Square. Those who had come to see this location in the heart of London as a rallying place for the common man and a forum for political action took this as a deliberate act of war. A demonstration was planned for the 13th of the month. Its pretext was to demand the release of Irish MP William O'Brien from prison, But the grievances expressed by the protesters extended far beyond this particular cause célèbre. Over 40,000 men and women gathered to make their point. They were greeted by 2,000 police, as well as the Queen's Life Guard and the Grenadier Guards. The clashes began almost immediately, and the police fell on the protesters with their truncheons. Despite pleas for a peaceful demonstration, many of the participants had come equipped with lead pipes, knives, hammers, and brickbats. 40 of the protesters were arrested, more than 200 were injured in the riot, and at least 2 were killed. Unfortunately, Bloody Sunday, as it came to be known, did not signal the end of the conflicts. The tinkle of smashing glass and outbursts of public rage continued well into the start of the following year. Through these two scenes moved 2 women whose lives and deaths would come to define the 19th century. One was Victoria, who gave her name to the era 1837 to 1901. The other was a homeless woman called Mary Ann, or Polly, Nichols, who was among those encamped at Trafalgar Square that year. Unlike the monarch, her identity would be largely forgotten, though the world would remember with great fascination and even relish the name of her killer, Jack the Ripper. Roughly 12 months lie between the Queen's Golden Jubilee summer and Polly Nichols's murder on the 31st of August 1888. She was to become the first of the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper, or those whose deaths the police determined were committed by the same hand in the East End district of Whitechapel. Her murder was followed by the discovery of the body of Annie Chapman in a yard off Hanbury Street on the 8th of September. In the early morning hours of the 30th of that month, the Ripper managed to strike twice. In what became known as the double event, he claimed the lives of Elizabeth Stride, who was found in Dutfield's yard off Berner Street, and Catherine Eddowes, who was killed in Mitre Square. After a brief pause in his murdering spree, he committed his final atrocity on the 9th of November, a complete mutilation of the body of Mary Jane Kelly as she lay in her bed at 13 Miller's Court. The brutality of the Whitechapel murders stunned London and most of the newspaper-reading world. All of the Ripper's victims had their throats cut. 4 of the 5 were then eviscerated. With the exception of the final killing, all of these violent deaths occurred in the open, under cover of darkness. In each case, the murderer managed to abscond, having left not a trace of his or her, or their, identity. Given the densely populated district in which these killings occurred, the public, the press, even the police, believed this to be remarkable. The Ripper always seemed one ghostly, ghoulish step ahead of the authorities, which bestowed upon the murders something extra terrifying and almost supernatural. The Whitechapel-based H Division of the Metropolitan Police did the best they could with their resources, but having never before faced a murder case of this scale and magnitude, they quickly found themselves overwhelmed. House-to-house inquiries were conducted throughout the area, and a wide variety of forensic material was gathered and analysed. The police were besieged with statements and letters from those who claimed to be witnesses, those offering assistance, and others who just liked spinning tales. In all, more than 2,000 people were interviewed and more than 300 were investigated as possible suspects. Even with additional assistance from Scotland Yard and the City of London Police, none of this yielded anything useful. Genuine leads were certain to have been lost among the swirling wash of paper they were forced to process. In the meantime, as constables scribbled into their notebooks and followed potential malefactors down dark alleys, the Ripper continued to kill. As the autumn of terror wore on, Whitechapel filled up with journalists, each of them hovering over this seam of sensationalist gold with pencils sharpened. The inevitable insertion of the press between the ongoing police investigation and an East End population living in a state of heightened alert proved explosive. In the absence of any conclusive information offered by the police, the newspapers were keen to posit their own theories about the killer and his modus operandi. The papers were flying off the newsstands, and the hunt for more content and better angles became insatiable. Invariably, embellishment, invention, and fake news found its way onto the page. However, printing rumours and hot-headed opinion pieces disparaging the efforts of the police did little to quell the anxiety of those who lived in Whitechapel. By the middle of September, residents were described as panic-stricken. Most were too terrified to leave their homes at night. Hooting and shouting crowds gathered outside the police station on Leman Street, demanding the arrest of the killer, and a Whitechapel Vigilance Society was founded by local tradesmen eager to take matters into their own hands. All the while, the press speculated wildly about the identity of the culprit. He was a Whitechapel man. He was a wealthy swell from the West End. He was a sailor, a Jew, a butcher, a surgeon, a foreigner, a lunatic, a gang of extortionists. The inhabitants of the neighbourhood began to attack anyone who fitted these descriptions. Doctors with medical bags were set upon. Men carrying parcels were reported to the police. Although sickened by events, many were also grotesquely intrigued by them. Just as crowds grew outside Leman Street police station, so they also gathered around the sites of the murders. Some stood staring at the places where the vicious deeds had been committed in the hope of finding answers, while others were simply entranced by the horror of the spectacle. As the police had failed to apprehend and charge a suspect for any of the 5 murders, the itch to see justice meted out in the form of a trial would never be salved. Instead, the only thing that offered a few answers and a degree of closure was the series of coroner's inquests into the killings. These were held publicly in Whitechapel and in the City of London in the wake of each murder, and covered extensively by the newspapers. At a coroner's inquest, much like a criminal trial, witnesses were called before a jury to give their account of events with an objective of piecing together a clear and official picture of how the death was incurred. Most of the information that exists about the 5 victims has been drawn from witness statements given during the inquests. However, these present a problematic account of events. The mode of examination lacked thoroughness, there were few follow-up questions from the jury, and inconsistencies and vagaries in the testimonies were never challenged. Ultimately, the information disclosed in the course of the inquests only skims the surface of a far deeper and murkier well of potential answers. If the Whitechapel murders served to expose anything, it was the unspeakably horrendous conditions in which the poor of that district lived. The encampment and riots at Trafalgar Square were merely a conspicuous manifestation of what had been chronically ailing in the East End and impoverished parts of London. It was a cough hacked in the face of the establishment. The emergence of Jack the Ripper was a louder and more violent one still. For most of Victoria's reign, journalists, social reformers and missionaries had been decrying the horrors of what they observed in the East End. But the situation began to grow more acute during the 1870s and 80s as the effects of the Long Depression bore down on the economy. What work there was for London's vast army of unskilled labourers, those who sewed and laundered the textiles, carried the bricks, assembled the goods, peddled in the streets and unloaded the ships, was poorly paid and insecure. Casual work on the docks might pay no more than 15 shillings a week. Sandwich board men who carried advertisements around the streets might make 1 shilling and 8p per day. To worsen matters, rents had been steadily climbing. The destruction of large swathes of lower-income housing across the capital to make way for railway developments and broad new thoroughfares like Shaftesbury Avenue had the effect of decanting London's poor into fewer, more densely packed spaces. Whitechapel was one of the most notorious of these, but was by no means the only sink of poverty in the capital. As social reformer Charles Booth's extensive study of London's impoverished areas in the 1890s revealed, pockets of destitution, crime and misery flourished throughout the metropolis, even within otherwise comfortable areas. However, Whitechapel's reputation trumped even that of Bermondsey, Lambeth, Southwark and St Pancras as being the most sordid. By the end of the 19th century, 78,000 souls were packed into this quarter of warehouses, lodging houses, factories, sweatshops, abattoirs, furnished rooms, pubs, cheap music halls and markets. Its overcrowded population was spiritually and culturally diverse, as well as multilingual. For at least 2 centuries, Whitechapel had been a focus for immigrants from around Europe. In the late 19th century, a large number were Irish, desperate to escape the rural poverty of the mother country. By the 1880s, they were joined by an exodus of Jews fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe. In an era highly suspicious of those of other nationalities, races, and religions, integration, even within the slums, did not occur naturally. Nevertheless, irrespective of their antecedents, Booth's social investigators regarded these residents as fairly uniform in terms of their social class. With a number of middle-class exceptions, a significant percentage of the inhabitants of Whitechapel were identified as poor, very poor, or semi-criminal. The throbbing dark heart at the centre of the district was Spitalfields. Here, near to the fruit and vegetable market and the soaring white spire of Christchurch, were situated some of the worst streets and accommodation in the area, if not in all of London. Dorset Street, Thrall Street, Flower and Dean Street, and the smaller thoroughfares contiguous to them, were feared even by the police. Lined primarily with cheap, vice-riddled lodging houses, or doss houses, and decrepit dwellings whose damp, crumbling interiors had been divided into individual furnished rooms for let, these streets and their desperate inhabitants became the embodiment of all that was rotten in England. Those who strayed into this abyss from the safety of the middle-class Victorian world were struck dumb by what they encountered. The broken pavements, dim gaslights, the slicks of sewage, stagnant pools of disease-breeding water, and rubbish-filled roadways foretold the physical horrors of what lay within the buildings. Vermin-infested rooms, 8 by 8 feet in size with broken windows, were inhabited by entire families. Health inspectors had found 5 children sharing a bed alongside a dead sibling awaiting burial. People slept on the floors, on heaps of rags and straw. Some had pawned all of their clothes and owned barely a scrap to cover their nakedness. Alcoholism, malnutrition, and disease were rife in this inner circle of hell, as was domestic violence. In fact, most forms of violence. Girls having barely reached puberty turned to prostitution to earn money. Boys just as easily slipped into thieving and pickpocketing. It appeared to moral middle-class England that in the face of this level of brutal, crippling want, every good and righteous instinct that would normally govern human relations had been completely eroded. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the common lodging houses, which offered shelter to those too poor to even afford a furnished room. The lodging houses provided temporary homes for the homeless, who divided their nights between the reeking beds on offer here, the oppression of the workhouse casual wards, and sleeping on the street. They were the haunts of beggars, criminals, prostitutes, chronic alcoholics, the unemployed, the sick and the old, the casual labourer, and the pensioned soldier. Most residents could be described as several of these. In Whitechapel alone, there were 233 common lodging houses, which accommodated an estimated 8,530 people without homes. Naturally, those on Dorset Street, Thrall Street, and Flower and Dean Street bore the worst reputations. 4p per night could buy someone a single, hard, flea-hopping bed in a stifling, stinking dormitory. 8p could buy an equally squalid double bed with a wooden partition around it. There were single-sex lodging houses and mixed lodging houses, though those that admitted both genders were acknowledged to be the most morally degenerate. All lodgers were entitled to make use of the communal kitchen, which was open all day and late into the night. Residents used this as a gathering place, cooking meagre meals and quaffing tea and beer with one another and anyone else who cared to drop in and visit. Social investigators and reformers who sat at these kitchen tables were appalled by the grotesque manners and the horrific language they heard, even from the children. However, it was the violent behaviour, degrading filth and overflowing toilets, in addition to the open displays of nakedness, free sexual intercourse, drunkenness and child neglect, to which they truly objected. In the Doss House, all that was offensive about the slum was concentrated under one roof. The police and reformers were especially concerned about the link that existed between common lodging houses and prostitution. As few questions were asked of a dosser so long as he or she could pay the 4 or 8p required for a bed, these places lent themselves to becoming hubs of immorality. Many women who regarded prostitution as their main source of income lived in or worked out of lodging houses, especially in the wake of the 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act, which saw the enforced closure of many brothels. The result of this meant that a large number of prostitutes were forced to ply their trade in places separate from where they lived. A lodging house with 8-penny doubles was a convenient place to take a man who had been solicited on the street. Other prostitutes chose to sleep in a cheaper 4-penny single, but see to their customers in dark corners outside, where quick sexual encounters, which frequently did not involve full intercourse, took place. Lodging houses provided shelter for a wide variety of women facing an assortment of unfortunate circumstances. While some of them resorted to what has been called casual prostitution, to broadly assume that all did is categorically wrong. Inhabitants were inventive when it came to scraping together their doss money. Most took on poorly paid casual labour, cleaning, laundering and hawking goods, and supplemented by borrowing, begging, pawning and sometimes stealing what was needed. Pairing up with a male partner was also an essential part of defraying costs. Often these relationships were short-lived and formed out of necessity, though others endured for months or years without ever being sanctified in a church. Middle-class observers were regularly horrified by how easily and quickly poor men and women could embark upon and dissolve these partnerships. Whether or not they resulted in children also seemed to be of little consequence. Naturally, this code of morality diverged considerably from the accepted standard and threw another layer of confusion over what exactly it was that the female residents of these wicked lodging houses were doing in order to keep a roof over their heads. During the Rippers' reign of terror, newspapers, eager to scandalise the nation with graphic details of slum life, regularly asserted that Whitechapel's lodging houses were brothels in all but name, and that the majority of women who inhabited them were, with very few exceptions, all prostitutes. In light of the terrible events, the public were willing to believe it. Hyperbole became enshrined as fact, despite the fact that the police themselves perceived the facts quite differently. A letter from the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, written at the height of the murder spree, told an altogether different story. After doing some rough calculations, Sir Charles Warren estimated that approximately 1,200 prostitutes inhabited Whitechapel's 233 common lodging houses. However, and more importantly, he qualified this statement by admitting, "We have no means of ascertaining what women are prostitutes and who are not." In other words, the newspapers were in no position to make this determination when even the police found distinguishing a prostitute from among her sisters an impossibility. Warren's figures present another intriguing prospect. If the lodging house population was comprised of 8,530 people, and 1/3, or 2,844 of those residents were female, and if it were to be accepted that 1,200 of these women could be identified as prostitutes, that would still indicate that the majority of them, or 1,644, were not engaged in any form of prostitution at all. Much like the inhabitants of Whitechapel's common lodging houses, the victims of Jack the Ripper and their lives had become entangled in a web of assumptions, rumour, and unfounded speculation. The spinning of these strands began over 130 years ago and, remarkably, has been left virtually undisturbed and unchallenged for all of this time. That which has continued to cling to and define the shape of Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Kate, and Mary Jane's stories is this: the values of the Victorian world. They are male, authoritarian, and middle class. They were formed at a time when women had no voice and few rights, and the poor were considered lazy and degenerate. To have been both of these things was one of the worst possible combinations. For over 130 years, we have embraced the dusty parcel we were handed. We have rarely ventured to peer inside it, or attempted to remove the thick wrapping that has kept us from knowing these women or their true histories. Jack the Ripper killed prostitutes, or so it has always been believed, but there is no hard evidence to suggest that 3 of his 5 victims were prostitutes at all. As soon as the bodies were discovered in dark yards or streets, the police assumed that they were prostitutes and that they had been killed by a maniac who had lured them to these places for sex. There is, and never was, any proof of this either. On the contrary, it was ascertained in the course of the coroner's inquests that Jack the Ripper never had sex with his victims. Additionally, in the case of each murder...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?